The elderly man walked slowly along the quiet street, his hand resting gently on the worn leather strap of his satchel. The morning sun had softened into a warm afternoon glow, and the town was alive with small movements. People walking dogs, a child chasing a balloon, and the hum of cars moving lazily down the main road. He had taken this route many times before, and each step brought back memories that mingled with the present. He wasn't in a hurry. Life had taught him patience, and after decades of service and work, he had learned that time moved at its own pace, and there was no reason to fight it. As he approached the small cafe at the corner, he noticed the familiar bell above the door jingling with each new visitor. It had been his spot for years, a place where he could sit quietly, watch the world, and enjoy a cup of coffee. The cafe smelled faintly of roasted beans and baked bread, a comforting mixture that always seemed to make him feel at home. He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, feeling the gentle warmth of the room wrap around him. It was quiet for a Friday afternoon, not crowded. Just a few regulars scattered at tables and a couple of people reading newspapers or working on their laptops. He moved toward the counter, his eyes scanning the familiar layout. The barista behind the counter was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a bright, energetic look, but a face that carried the impatience of someone always in a rush. The elderly man smiled politely as he approached, ready to place his order like he had done countless times before. But today was different. The young man looked at him, and for a moment the smile faded from his face. "You really shouldn't be walking around here all slow and old," he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Maybe you should just sit at home and let people like us do the work." The elderly man froze, the words landing heavily on him. He had heard disrespect before, but there was something sharper about the way they were spoken today, aimed not just at him as a person, but at everything he had done in his life. For a brief second, he felt the weight of every year he had lived, every battle he had fought, every sacrifice he had made, all reduced to someone else's careless comment. He tried to let it slide. He cleared his throat and said softly, "I'll just have a coffee, please. Black, no sugar." His voice was calm, steady, but inside a storm of emotion churned. The young man shrugged, clearly not paying much attention anymore, and turned to make the coffee. The elderly man paid, carefully counting out the change, his hands slightly trembling. He wondered how respect had become such a rare thing, how words could wound more than action sometimes. He chose a seat near the window, a place where he could see the world outside without being too visible to those inside. He placed his satchel gently on the chair next to him and sat down, smoothing out his old jacket. It was worn but well cared for, adorned with a few faded pins and medals that told the story of a life full of service. Each pin had its own history, each medal a memory of moments that had shaped him into the man he was today. As he stirred his coffee, he looked out the window at the people passing by. A young mother held her child's hand tightly as they walked. A jogger ran past with headphones on, lost in his own rhythm, and a group of teenagers laughed as they biked along the sidewalk. The world moved on, indifferent to the small insults and pains of any one person. And yet, in that quiet corner of the cafe, he felt a strange mix of isolation and connection. He was alone, but he was also part of something larger, a lifetime of experiences that had given him perspective and patience. Other patrons noticed the interaction at the counter. A woman sitting nearby glanced up from her book, her eyes briefly meeting his. She gave a small, sympathetic smile before returning to her reading. A man across the room shook his head slightly, muttering something under his breath about respect for elders. These small gestures reminded him that while some people might fail to recognize the value of experience, others did notice, and even small acknowledgments of respect could restore a sense of balance. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, the bitterness, and the small comfort it brought. Each sip was a reminder that despite the insult, life still offered moments of peace and simple pleasure. He thought about the years he had spent in the military, the long days, the hardships, and the friendships that had lasted a lifetime. The memories were both sweet and bitter, filled with the faces of friends he had lost and the camaraderie that had sustained him through difficult times. As he sat there, the young barista occasionally glanced over, perhaps realizing the weight of what he had said. But the elderly man didn't want confrontation. He had learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything, and he preferred quiet dignity over loud arguments. Still, he couldn't ignore the sting of the words, and he allowed himself a small moment of reflection, thinking about how respect could sometimes be so fleeting and fragile. The cafe itself seemed to settle into a calm rhythm. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the faint music playing in the background created a cocoon of normalcy around him. He watched as the barista moved behind the counter, preparing drinks with practiced efficiency, and he noticed the small details of the cafe that he had always appreciated, the way the sunlight fell on the tables, the smell of freshly baked pastries, and the warmth that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. He took out a small notebook from his satchel, something he carried almost everywhere. Inside were scribbles, notes, and sketches he had made over the years, a personal record of thoughts, memories, and reflections. He began to write slowly, capturing the feeling of the moment, the mix of hurt, nostalgia, and quiet observation. Writing had always been his way of processing the world, a way to turn fleeting emotions into something tangible and lasting. Minutes passed in this quiet, introspective state. The elderly man felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere as a few more patrons entered the cafe. He noticed the changes in the faces around him, the expressions of curiosity, sympathy, or simple indifference. And though the young barista continued his work behind the counter, the elderly man felt a quiet strength rising within him, a reminder that the judgment of one person could never erase the life he had lived or the respect he had earned over decades of service. Outside, the street continued its steady pace. A car pulled up and the driver honked briefly before continuing on. Children ran past on their way home from school, their laughter echoing in the afternoon air. Birds chirped from nearby trees, their songs small reminders of life's persistence. All of this combined to create a backdrop for his own quiet resolve. He may have been insulted, but he would not let it define him. As he finished his coffee, he sat back in his chair and took a deep breath. The warmth of the cup in his hands had given him a small comfort, the quiet of the room a chance to gather his thoughts. He knew that moments like this were tests, not of patience alone, but of character. How he chose to respond, how he carried himself in the face of disrespect, would reveal more than any words could. The elderly man adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and allowed himself a small smile. Life had not always been easy, and it was certainly not perfect, but it had been meaningful. And in that quiet cafe, with the soft afternoon light spilling across the tables and the gentle hum of conversation around him, he felt a sense of calm determination. The insult would fade, the moment would pass, but his dignity and sense of self would remain intact. He looked once more out the window, noticing the people moving through their own lives, each with their own stories, challenges, and victories. He felt connected to them, not in words or actions, but in the simple human understanding that everyone had a path, everyone faced struggles, and everyone deserved to be treated with kindness. He returned to his notebook, writing a few more lines, capturing the essence of the moment, the quiet resilience, the small joys, and the unwavering sense of self that had carried him through decades. By the time he finished, the cafe had become slightly busier. The elderly man closed his notebook, set it carefully in his satchel, and took a last sip of coffee. He felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that life had a way of balancing itself in unexpected ways. The insult, though sharp, was only a small part of the larger story. A story filled with respect, honor, and experiences that could not be diminished by a single careless remark. And as he prepared to leave his table, a subtle feeling of anticipation stirred within him, though he did not know why. Something in the air seemed different, a hint that the ordinary afternoon might soon shift in ways he could not yet imagine. He stood, carefully lifted his satchel, and adjusted his jacket. Life had taught him that moments of challenge often preceded moments of connection, and he carried that quiet wisdom with him as he settled in for the rest of his visit, unaware that within minutes the ordinary cafe would become the setting for an extraordinary turn of events. The elderly man sat quietly in the cafe, finishing the last of his coffee, while the world outside continued in its usual rhythm. The warm sunlight streamed through the window, casting a gentle glow on the table in front of him. He could hear the faint chatter of people nearby, the clinking of cups and plates, and the soft rustle of a newspaper being turned by a patron at the next table. It was a calm scene, the kind he had always appreciated. Yet beneath this ordinary afternoon, something was beginning to shift. As he stirred his thoughts, memories from his years in the military quietly surfaced. He remembered the first time he had stepped onto the base, a young man filled with determination and pride, eager to serve his country. He remembered the long marches, the sleepless nights, the challenges that tested his strength, courage, and patience. Most of all, he remembered the bonds he had formed with the people he served alongside, friendships that had withstood the test of time and distance. Those memories brought a quiet smile to his face, but also a touch of sadness for friends he had lost along the way. While he reflected, he noticed a few people outside the window who seemed to move with a sense of purpose. Cars slowly drove past, and a man holding a clipboard paused near the entrance of a nearby building. Children ran past in pairs, their laughter ringing in the air. Life was moving on, indifferent to the small moments that shaped his own afternoon. Yet he felt a sense of anticipation, a subtle pull that made him aware that something different might soon unfold. Inside the cafe, the young barista continued his work, occasionally glancing over at the elderly man. The first insult still lingered, though not as sharply as before. The young man seemed uncertain, a flicker of awareness passing across his face. He had grown up in a world where respect often came in fleeting gestures, where attention was rarely paid to the experiences of older generations. Now, seeing the calm dignity of the man he had insulted, he felt an unfamiliar sense of discomfort, the realization that he had spoken thoughtlessly. The elderly man, aware of the glance, did not respond with anger. He had learned long ago that anger rarely brought understanding. Instead, he returned to his notebook, scribbling quietly, recording thoughts and reflections. The lines on the page formed a silent conversation with himself, a reminder of the strength that came from experience and patience. Each word carried a sense of self-respect, a small act of reclaiming dignity in a moment that could have otherwise been hurtful. Outside, the atmosphere began to shift in subtle ways. A few cars approached, slowing down as they neared the cafe. A group of older men stepped out together, wearing casual jackets and hats that suggested a shared history. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of living with purpose and honor. They had finished a meeting of the local veterans club nearby and were considering stopping for a quick snack. One of them noticed the elderly man through the window and nudged the others. "That's Frank," he said softly. "He used to lead the regiment back in the day. Let's go say hello." The others nodded, and without hesitation they walked toward the entrance of the cafe. Their footsteps were measured, each movement conveying both respect and recognition of the man inside. They had known him for years, shared battles and victories, and even losses that had left lasting scars. They approached not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the simple authenticity of people who understood the value of friendship, service, and respect. As the door opened, the bell jingled softly, announcing their arrival. The elderly man looked up briefly, his eyes meeting the group as they entered. A warm smile spread across his face, a mixture of surprise and pleasure. The tension of the earlier insult seemed to dissipate in an instant, replaced by a sense of belonging and camaraderie. He had been alone for just a short while, but now he felt the weight of friendship and shared history returning, as though the presence of these familiar faces could heal even the sting of a careless word. The veterans moved through the cafe with ease, greeting the barista politely, nodding to other patrons, and making their way toward the table where the elderly man sat. There was no rush, no urgency, just the natural flow of people coming together in recognition of one another. Other patrons watched quietly, sensing that something special was happening, though they did not yet understand the depth of it. The first veteran reached the table and extended his hand. The elderly man took it firmly, feeling the strength and warmth of a handshake that spoke of shared experiences and mutual respect. Another veteran leaned down slightly, offering a gentle pat on the shoulder, a gesture of familiarity and comfort. The elderly man's eyes glistened slightly as he acknowledged each greeting, appreciating the sincerity that radiated from the group. Conversations began to flow naturally. The veterans spoke of light-hearted memories, of small victories during their service, of the laughter and camaraderie that had helped them through the toughest times. The elderly man joined in, sharing a story or two, his voice calm and steady, carrying the weight of years but also the ease of someone comfortable in their own skin. The cafe filled with warmth, not loud or boisterous but quiet and heartfelt. The young barista standing behind the counter watched the scene unfold. He felt a mix of surprise, embarrassment, and admiration. He had not expected such a powerful presence to enter the cafe, and he realized now the significance of the man he had insulted. Respect, he saw, was not just about politeness. It was about understanding someone's life, their struggles, and the contributions they had made. The young man felt a quiet urge to make amends, to acknowledge that he had been wrong. Meanwhile, the elderly man felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond the words spoken. He had faced insults and challenges before, but there was something profoundly comforting about being surrounded by people who truly understood his journey. The veterans did not need to explain themselves. Their presence alone was a testament to shared experiences, to honor, and to the bonds formed in service and friendship. Other patrons began to notice small gestures. One veteran placing a cup of coffee gently in front of the elderly man, another asking if he needed anything else. A young woman at a nearby table whispered to her friend about the scene, clearly moved by the dignity and respect on display. A man reading the newspaper put it down and watched quietly, sensing a lesson in the way life could transform a moment of insult into a gathering of recognition and warmth. The conversation continued, flowing effortlessly from memories of the past to reflections on the present. The elderly man spoke of places he had been, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned. The veterans responded with nods, shared laughter, and stories of their own, creating a tapestry of experiences that connected everyone at the table. It was a quiet celebration of life, service, and the enduring power of human connection. The young barista finally stepped forward, his voice soft but sincere. I'm sorry for what I said earlier, he said, avoiding the temptation to explain or justify. The elderly man looked up at him, his eyes kind but steady, and nodded. Thank you, he said simply. That means a lot. There was no anger, no lingering resentment, just the calm acknowledgement that respect could be restored when offered honestly. The veterans around them added their voices gently, emphasizing that everyone deserved kindness and understanding. They spoke of how small gestures, small words could make a significant difference in someone's day. The elderly man listened, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The insult that had once seemed sharp and cutting had now become a small moment in a larger story, one filled with respect, recognition, and the warmth of human connection. Outside, the afternoon continued its steady flow. Cars moved past, children laughed in the distance, and the town went about its usual routines. Inside the cafe, however, time seemed to bend slightly, stretching to accommodate the stories, the laughter, and the quiet reflection that filled the space. The elderly man felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was surrounded by people who understood not only his past but also the value of his presence in the world today. He returned to his notebook briefly, jotting down a few thoughts about the unexpected joy that had entered his afternoon. Each line was a reminder that life had a way of balancing itself, of bringing recognition when it was most needed, and that even moments of discomfort could be transformed into experiences of connection and warmth. He wrote slowly, savoring the feeling of being understood, of being appreciated, and of being part of something larger than himself. By the time the group of veterans had settled fully at his table, the cafe had taken on a new energy. Other patrons who had been quiet and watchful began to relax, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding. The elderly man, once quietly hurt by a single careless remark, now felt celebrated in a way he had not expected. The presence of those who knew and respected him brought a profound comfort, a reminder that dignity and honor could not be taken away by a single thoughtless comment. As they shared stories, laughter, and quiet reflections, the elderly man realized that life was full of moments like this, moments that could turn ordinary days into extraordinary experiences. He looked around at the veterans, at the barista, and at the other patrons, feeling a renewed sense of hope and connection. The world was still moving. The cafe had transformed from a quiet, ordinary place into something entirely different. The moment the veterans walked in, the atmosphere shifted. There was a quiet dignity in the room now, a subtle respect that seemed to ripple through every corner. Patrons who had been minding their own business suddenly became aware of the presence of people who carried experience, wisdom, and the weight of a life lived with purpose. The elderly man sat at his table, watching his old friends settle in, and felt a sense of warmth that went beyond the simple comfort of coffee or pastries. The veterans arranged themselves naturally around his table, some sitting while others leaned casually against nearby chairs. Each face told its own story. Lines etched into their skin spoke of years of laughter, struggle, and perseverance. Their eyes held memories of places that were far away, battles fought, victories and losses that had shaped them in ways that words could never fully capture. They didn't need to speak to convey all of this. Their presence alone carried meaning. The elderly man, feeling a mix of pride and surprise, welcomed each greeting with a gentle smile and firm handshake. The group laughed quietly together, their voices low but rich with familiarity. Some shared small jokes from their past, moments that had seemed trivial at the time but had become cherished memories. The room itself seemed to listen, as if the walls understood the significance of what was unfolding. Other patrons could not help but notice the transformation. A young couple whispered to each other, their heads leaning close together, clearly moved by the display of camaraderie and respect. The young barista behind the counter watched with growing unease and reflection. He had arrived at work that day expecting nothing more than routine coffee orders and the occasional small talk with regulars. He had not anticipated being a witness to such an extraordinary scene. As he prepared drinks, he glanced repeatedly at the elderly man and the veterans. There was a quiet authority in their presence, a dignity that demanded recognition, even without a word being spoken. The barista realized that his earlier insult was insignificant in comparison to the lives and experiences seated before him. One of the veterans, a man with a kind but firm expression, spoke up, sharing a story from decades ago. He told of a time during their service when a small act of courage had saved a fellow soldier. The elderly man listened intently, nodding at the right moments, adding his own reflections in a calm voice that conveyed both respect and shared understanding. The conversation moved naturally, flowing from past experiences to reflections on the present. Laughter occasionally punctuated the dialogue, gentle and heartfelt, a sound that seemed to lighten the air around them. The other patrons in the cafe could not ignore the subtle change in energy. What had been a quiet afternoon now carried a sense of occasion. Even those who did not know the veterans personally felt the respect radiating from the group. Some smiled quietly, feeling the warmth of human connection. Others leaned in slightly, curious about the stories being told, sensing that this was a moment worth observing, something meaningful in its simplicity. The elderly man felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not only were his friends present, but the act of coming together in this ordinary space created a profound sense of belonging. He realized that respect was not just given, it was earned, recognized, and shared. The small insult he had received earlier seemed insignificant now, a fleeting shadow in contrast to the light of friendship and recognition surrounding him. The veterans began to acknowledge the other patrons, nodding and offering brief greetings. This simple act reminded everyone present that their purpose was not to intimidate or show superiority, but to honor connections and recognize dignity. One of the veterans offered a small pastry to a child at a nearby table, while another complimented a young woman's sketchbook that she had laid out on the table beside her coffee. The gestures were small but meaningful, spreading warmth beyond the circle of veterans and the elderly man. The elderly man reflected quietly on how life had brought him here. There had been years of hard work, sacrifice, and challenges that had tested his resolve. There had been moments of loneliness and misunderstanding. And yet here he was, surrounded by people who understood him without needing explanations. He realized that life had a way of creating balance, of offering recognition and connection when it was most needed. Even in the most unexpected ways, the conversation between the veterans continued, moving seamlessly from one memory to another. They shared stories of courage, instances of kindness, and small victories that had given them hope during difficult times. Each story was met with laughter, thoughtful nods, and moments of quiet reflection. The elderly man contributed, sharing insights he had gained from his own experiences. His voice was steady and measured, carrying a weight that drew the attention of everyone present. The young barista, watching from behind the counter, began to feel a shift within himself. He had arrived at work with little expectation beyond routine tasks, yet he was witnessing a lesson in humility and respect. He understood now that words could wound, but they could also be redeemed through sincere acknowledgement and the presence of people who understood the value of life's experiences. He moved with a little more care, pouring coffee and preparing drinks with gentle attention, recognizing the significance of the moment unfolding in front of him. The other patrons, sensing the depth of the conversation, began to engage in quiet ways. A woman offered a warm smile to the elderly man as he shared a story. A young man who had been quietly working on a laptop looked up, clearly moved by the narrative unfolding. Even those who did not speak felt connected to the warmth in the room. It was a quiet ripple of humanity, a subtle reminder that respect and understanding could touch even those who were mere observers. As the minutes passed, the energy in the cafe grew richer. The elderly man felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced insults and challenges before, but moments like this reminded him of the resilience and dignity inherent in life. The veteran's presence was a testament to the enduring power of friendship, respect, and shared history. Each person at the table contributed to a sense of balance and harmony, a reminder that life's value was measured not only in accomplishments but in connections and understanding. The elderly man glanced at his notebook once more, jotting down a few lines. He wrote about the warmth of being understood, the quiet joy of friendship, and the unexpected comfort of recognition. Writing had always been his way of making sense of the world, and now the words on the page carried an extra layer of meaning. They were not just reflections, but a record of a moment that had transformed an ordinary afternoon into something deeply memorable. Outside, the day continued, but inside the cafe, time seemed to stretch and bend. The conversations, the laughter, and the quiet reflections created a cocoon of warmth. Patrons who had come for a simple coffee found themselves witnessing a gathering that carried subtle lessons about life, respect, and the enduring bonds of human connection. The elderly man felt a deep sense of gratitude for this experience, knowing that it would linger in his memory for years to come. The veterans began to share lighter stories, memories that brought laughter and smiles. They recounted moments of mischief, unexpected friendships, and the small victories that had sustained them during difficult times. The elderly man joined in, recounting a few incidents from his own past, the room filling with a gentle harmony of voices. It was not loud or chaotic, but it was alive with life, experience, and the quiet power of shared understanding. The young barista, still observing from behind the counter, finally approached with a small tray of drinks. He placed it carefully in front of the elderly man, his hands steady but his expression tinged with humility. I made these for you and your friends," he said softly. "Please enjoy." The elderly man looked up, meeting the barista's eyes, and nodded. "Thank you," he said warmly. "That means a lot." The simple exchange carried more weight than either of them realized, a quiet act of reconciliation and understanding. The veterans acknowledged the gesture with small nods and smiles, emphasizing that it was not about recognition alone, but about mutual respect. They spoke quietly to the young barista, sharing insights about life, patience, and the importance of understanding the people around us. The words were gentle but meaningful, leaving a subtle impression that would not be forgotten. The elderly man reflected on how life had a way of bringing lessons to the surface when they were most needed. The insult he had received earlier, though sharp at the time, had led to this moment of connection, warmth, and recognition. He realized that life's balance was often found in unexpected ways, and that even ordinary spaces could become sites of extraordinary experiences when people came together with respect and understanding. As the group continued to converse, the other patrons began to relax further, sensing that something special was unfolding. A quiet energy filled the room, a mix of admiration, respect, and subtle joy. Even those who had arrived for a simple coffee now felt a sense of connection to the moment. Understanding on some level the importance of dignity, recognition, and shared humanity, the elderly man smiled quietly, feeling the weight of his own experiences alongside the stories of the veterans. He realized that life had offered him. The cafe hummed with quiet energy, a mixture of conversation, laughter, and the subtle clinking of cups and saucers. The elderly man sat at the table with his friends, the veterans who had arrived unexpectedly, and for the first time that afternoon, he felt completely at ease. The earlier insult felt like a distant memory, a shadow that had been replaced by warmth, recognition, and a deep sense of belonging. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, each one reflecting years of experience, wisdom, and the quiet strength that came from shared service and friendship. The young barista, who had once been the source of hurtful words, now approached the table with a nervous but sincere expression. He carried a tray of freshly brewed coffee and a small plate of pastries, placing them carefully in front of the elderly man and his friends. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry again," he said softly. "I didn't mean what I said earlier, and I want to make it right." The elderly man looked up at him, his eyes calm and steady, and offered a gentle nod. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your words matter, and I appreciate the effort." It was not just a forgiveness. It was a moment of connection, a lesson in humility and understanding that the young barista would carry with him long after the day ended. The veterans around the table spoke quietly to the young man, sharing stories of patience, respect, and the importance of recognizing the value of every person. They did not scold him or make him feel small. Instead, they offered gentle guidance, emphasizing that life's lessons were often learned through experience and reflection. The young barista listened intently, absorbing the words and realizing that respect was more than just politeness. It was understanding, empathy, and acknowledgement of the journeys others had taken. Meanwhile, the elderly man felt a quiet sense of pride and gratitude. He had faced many challenges in his life, from the hardships of military service to the small cruelties of daily life, and yet here he was, surrounded by people who understood, appreciated, and respected him. The cafe had become more than a place for coffee. It had become a space of connection, understanding, and subtle celebration of human dignity. Other patrons began to take notice. A woman sitting at a nearby table paused in her reading to observe the scene, her eyes reflecting curiosity and admiration. A young man working on a laptop looked up, clearly affected by the quiet warmth emanating from the table of veterans and the elderly man. Even those who had come to the cafe for routine purposes found themselves drawn into the atmosphere, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding before them. The veterans continued to share stories, their voices calm and steady, filled with the richness of experience. They spoke of moments of courage and moments of kindness, of small victories and simple joys that had made a difference in their lives and the lives of others. The elderly man contributed his own stories, recounting memories from his past with a quiet confidence and measured humor. Laughter occasionally punctuated the conversation, soft and heartfelt, carrying a sense of shared history and deep understanding. The young barista moved around the cafe, attending to other customers but always glancing back at the table. He felt a growing sense of respect, not only for the elderly man, but for the veterans who had arrived to support him. Their presence was a reminder that small actions could have a profound impact, that recognizing someone's worth could change the energy of an entire space. He realized that the moment he had insulted the elderly man was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a lesson in empathy and understanding that he would not forget. The elderly man, sipping his coffee, felt a subtle shift within himself as well. The presence of his friends, the acknowledgement of the young barista, and the reactions of other patrons reminded him of the quiet power of connection. Life had not always been easy, but it had offered him moments of recognition, understanding, and warmth that had made all the hardships worthwhile. He reflected on the way life had a way of balancing itself, turning moments of insult into opportunities for growth, connection, and subtle celebration of dignity. One of the veterans leaned forward and asked the elderly man about a medal on his jacket, a small faded pin that held a significant story. The elderly man smiled and recounted the story, his voice calm but rich with emotion. It was a tale of bravery, of moments when courage mattered more than fear, and of the quiet pride that comes from doing one's duty. The veterans listened intently, nodding in appreciation, their expressions reflecting admiration and understanding. The other patrons continued to watch quietly, sensing that the stories being shared were more than just memories. They were lessons in life, resilience, and the value of human connection. A child at a nearby table whispered to a parent, pointing at the elderly man and his friends, clearly intrigued by the way they carried themselves and the respect they commanded. Even the youngest observer could sense the importance of the moment, understanding in some intuitive way that dignity and honor were present in that space. The elderly man felt a sense of satisfaction as the conversation continued. He realized That respect was not simply demanded, it was recognized, nurtured, and shared. The veteran's presence was a reminder that his life had meaning, that the experiences he had endured and the contributions he had made were acknowledged and valued. The earlier insult seemed insignificant now, a small ripple in the larger flow of understanding and connection that surrounded him. The young barista, inspired by the scene before him, decided to take a small step further. He approached the table with a notebook, asking if he could write down a few of the veterans' stories to share in the cafe's newsletter. The veterans agreed, smiling at the thought of their experiences being recorded and shared with others. The elderly man nodded in support, recognizing that this simple act could spread the lessons of respect, courage, and human connection to a wider audience. As the afternoon progressed, the energy in the cafe grew richer and more inclusive. Veterans made small gestures of kindness to other patrons, offering smiles, brief greetings, and words of encouragement. The elderly man observed this with a quiet sense of pride, realizing that their presence was not only honoring him, but also elevating the atmosphere of the entire space. Every gesture, no matter how small, carried significance, reminding everyone present of the value of empathy, respect, and shared humanity. The conversations flowed seamlessly, moving from past experiences to reflections on life in the present. The veterans spoke of lessons learned, of moments when courage and patience had made a difference, and of the importance of supporting one another through challenges. The elderly man contributed his own insights, his voice calm, measured, and filled with the weight of experience. Together, they created a tapestry of shared understanding, a quiet celebration of life, service, and the bonds that connect people across generations. The young barista, watching quietly, felt a profound change in his perspective. He had arrived at work expecting routine tasks and ordinary interactions, but he was witnessing something extraordinary. He realized that respect and kindness could transform a space, that understanding and acknowledgement could turn ordinary moments into experiences of deep significance. He moved with care and attention, serving other patrons while absorbing the lessons unfolding before him. Other customers began to engage more openly, sensing the warmth and dignity radiating from the table of veterans. A young woman asked a veteran about a story he had mentioned, clearly interested in learning more. A man sitting alone at a nearby table put down his phone and listened attentively, drawn into the quiet richness of the conversation. Even those who had initially been indifferent found themselves affected by the atmosphere, realizing that respect, recognition, and shared humanity had the power to touch everyone present. The elderly man reflected on the transformation that had occurred in such a short time. What had begun as a simple insult had evolved into a gathering of warmth, understanding, and subtle celebration of dignity. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the veteran's presence, for the young barista's acknowledgement, and for the quiet engagement of other patrons. Life had a way of balancing itself, offering lessons and recognition in ways that were often unexpected but profoundly meaningful. The veterans continued to share their experiences, stories that moved seamlessly between humor, reflection, and moments of quiet wisdom. The elderly man participated fully, his own stories adding depth to the conversation and drawing gentle laughter and thoughtful nods from his friends. Each anecdote, each reflection, was a thread in the fabric of shared humanity, connecting everyone present and reminding them of the enduring power of respect, empathy, and understanding. As the afternoon waned, the cafe's energy remained vibrant yet calm. The elderly man felt a sense of completeness, a quiet satisfaction that came from being recognized, understood, and valued. He knew that the moments spent here, surrounded by friends and fellow veterans, would linger in his memory long after the cafe had emptied and the day had moved on. The earlier insult had been transformed into a moment of connection, reflection, and subtle celebration of human dignity, leaving him with a renewed sense of purpose and peace. The young barista approached one final time, this time with a gentle smile and a few extra pastries. "I hope you enjoy these," he said softly.